All right, everyone. I'm really happy and glad to see that you are so deep in your discussions, but it's time for the final session of today. So please do join me here in the room. All right, so I hope you're enjoying the forum so far. I think we've had some really interesting sessions and discussions. A few things have been mentioned here and there, talking about carbon price, border carbon adjustment, or specifically CBAM, typically emissions trading scheme, etc. And that's what we're going to dive into now. So we're going to, in this session, we're going to examine how carbon costing is shaping the economics of steelmaking today, and the new developments that we see. You're all very well aware of the EU's carbon border adjustment being implemented, and the sort of effects that is having. So in this session, we'll be talking about border carbon adjustments, not specifically on CBAM. I know you all have very specific questions on that, but this is a more of a conceptual discussion around these tools and how they might impact on the level playing field and the cost of carbon, and in turn the steel industry transition. So let me welcome. Well, yes, I realize there's one slide per person, but please do come up. So I have with me on stage in this session Alice Tipping from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and also Claire Curry from BloombergNEF, but you will see her slide in a little while. So we're going to start with two scene-setting presentations. Alice is going to talk to you about border carbon adjustments, and Claire more broadly about emissions trading scheme and the cost of carbon for steel. And then we're going to have an open discussion. I prepared some questions, but I really would like you to interact with this session. Tell us what you are thinking and what your questions are. I'm not promising any answers, but I do promise to put lots of thoughts in your heads. So, all right.
It does work. Yes, thank you. Let me know if you can't hear me. Well, thank you very much indeed, Åsa, and thank you to the World Steel Association for the invitation to be here today. I have to preface everything I say with a confession, which will become very clear as I go on, that I am not a steel expert. I'm a trade policy person and a trade policy lawyer at heart. I do know that electric arc furnaces that use scrap have lower emissions than blast furnaces, but please don't ask me to explain anything else about your industry or how it works, although I have to say the session I sat at the corner in just now was extremely useful. So I'm going to give perhaps a more, as Åsa was saying, a more conceptual view of how in the trade policy community we see the question of carbon pricing, in particular border carbon adjustments, right? Border carbon adjustments are essentially where different carbon prices intersect, and it's an issue that's come up a lot in the trade policy space. So to get started with the basics, and many of you will be very familiar with graphs like this. So we start with the absolute reality that we have different forms of carbon pricing across the world. We have carbon taxes, we have emissions trading schemes. Some countries have them, some countries don't. Some countries combine them with emissions crediting, some countries don't. And from the trade perspective, the obvious issue that this brings up, and you will all be very familiar with this, is what happens when imports of a particular product from a country that doesn't have carbon pricing or has it at a lower level enters a jurisdiction that has a much higher carbon level. And the answer, of course, is that you begin to consider issues of leakage, and that came up earlier in the session this afternoon. And one of the answers to the leakage problem, not the only one, but one that many governments are starting to think about or starting to implement, is the idea of a border carbon adjustment, essentially requiring imports of a particular product to pay for the emissions created in their production of that product, so that they, at least on the basis of carbon emissions, encounter a level playing field, at least with respect to that particular value, with products produced domestically. This is all very familiar to you, I know. What's been interesting in following this issue from a trade policy perspective, so I sit in Geneva, my organization IISD is a think tank with a headquarters in Winnipeg in Canada, but a very large office in Geneva, and the trade policy team is the team that I lead in Geneva. And as we've been watching this issue come up in the trade policy discussion, what's been interesting over the last few years is to see that we are no longer talking just about one kind of border carbon adjustment. We're talking about the potential for several. You all know very well, CBAM enters its definitive phase, it's in it now. Serbia looking at the beginning of a border carbon adjustment mechanism as well, the UK launching one potentially next year. We've seen other governments begin to think about the use of border carbon adjustments. Australia's government commissioned its carbon leakage review, which recommended a border carbon adjustment for cement and clinker. This is not Australian government policy, please don't get me wrong, but it is at least the response of the academic review led into leakage options. Chinese Taipei considering a pilot for the cement sector starting next year. Canada has consulted on the idea of a border carbon adjustment, but has certainly not adopted one yet. And we know that in Turkey there's a discussion about scoping particular sectors that might be exposed to carbon leakage. And there are a number of special cases, Norway and Iceland, because of their connection to the EU. The United States is a very interesting jurisdiction always to look at, and we've seen news you may have seen yesterday from the Department of Energy starting to lean into the idea of exploring, at least from an academic perspective, exploring the idea of something relating to a border carbon adjustment, or rather a border carbon pricing mechanism. So the question I think that this has raised in our minds as we look at it from a trade policy perspective is firstly, how do we help governments think through how to make border carbon adjustments both effective in driving carbon action, but also fair to developing countries and their producers? But also, how do you make sure that border carbon adjustments don't create too much friction in trade policy, right? And too much either political friction or technical friction for businesses. These are the sort of technical problems that many of your businesses may well be struggling with. So what we have done is to follow a couple of different stories, to follow the cinematographic arc. We've seen an evolving political story and an evolving technical story. So the evolving political story, if you want to call it Act 1, that we saw in both the climate policy space and the trade policy space, is that developing countries responded to the idea of border carbon adjustments in the climate space by arguing vehemently that unilateral trade measures were inconsistent with the principles of the climate conventions, right? Common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. At the WTO, for a number of years, interventions at the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment focused on discontent and focused on concern, right? Many developing countries argued that border carbon adjustments, whatever their rationale or justification, were protectionist trade barriers. And what we've seen over the years, in part by, I think, as a result of work that think tanks like ours, with support of others in the room, have brought into the discussion, is that conversations are gradually moving from denial and deference to an acceptance that border carbon adjustments will become a reality in the global trade space. And the question for trade policymakers becomes, how do you help businesses comply? How do you make sure that small and medium enterprises and value chains aren't locked out because of these new requirements? And how eventually, and this is where the interesting conversations are starting to happen, how do you eventually start thinking about the interoperability of different border carbon adjustments? So we've seen in the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment, the discussion now focuses on questions of interoperability of trade-related climate measures, focuses on the development dimension, what particular challenges do developing countries and their businesses face, and also increasingly on how do you ensure transparency of the measures that are coming down the pipeline. I'll get into exactly why transparency is a question a bit later on. So there's discussions at the multilateral level. There's some discussions emerging in fora like the Integrated Forum on Climate Mitigation Approaches. This is led by the OECD, and other clubs on what the spillovers, i.e. the international impacts of carbon pricing choices could be. And very interestingly, we start to see trade agreements, like the EU's agreement with India, start to become a place where governments can talk about cooperation around border carbon adjustments and their integration and their use. So the political story, I think, has moved sort of from Act 1 into at least Scene 1 of Act 2. And the interesting question will be how some of these more pragmatic conversations, how they evolve. One important point to make, and I realized this as I looked at the slide on the plane this morning, the pragmatism that I'm referring to in these conversations is pragmatism very much that's emerged in the trade policy space. We are yet to see whether a similar kind of pragmatism can be taken up in the UN climate space. So the UNFCCC has for the first time trade measures formally on the agenda of the subsidiary bodies that meet in Bonn this month, in fact, and I have colleagues going to see how that goes. But we've seen the trade policy space be more progressive, more pragmatic, more focused on the technical problems, acknowledging the politics and not leaving them behind, but moving ahead with more pragmatic and more practical discussions. So that was the political side. The technical story, and here is where we've been trying to help governments find a way forward. The technical story has been more about how do governments specifically design border carbon adjustments, again, to make them effective and fair. What we've done as a think tank is to convene a number of stakeholders across different countries, and then at the global level, and thank you, Asa, for helping us with that process, to look at, from a range of different perspectives, public and private, think tank and academic, from a range of different countries, if you brought stakeholders in this debate together, what would they want to see in a border carbon adjustment? And we focused on the 6 key design features that we think shape how a border carbon adjustment works. And so the first question, how do you measure in a border carbon adjustment the different GHG emissions that are embedded in goods? And the sense overall from stakeholders is that you want in a border carbon adjustment to be able to maximize the interoperability between your measure and another country's. You probably want to consider transition periods so that countries at different levels of development, or so that companies at different levels of size have an on-ramp into reporting and then payment. And from a trade policy perspective, you want to keep treatment between different producers non-discriminatory. I think the last few years have shown us very clearly what the politicization of trade policy can do. And from a trade policy perspective, again, and making sure that producers across the world have a chance to compete, keeping treatment objectively non-discriminatory is important. Second big key design feature in a BCA, what goods do you cover and what emission scopes do you use? And the sense that emerged from stakeholders is that you want to cover in a border carbon adjustment only the goods that are really at risk of leakage. So not necessarily every product that's covered by your emissions trading scheme or carbon tax, but where leakage is really an issue. And you want to keep the scope of emissions that producers are required, or rather importers are required to report against, congruent with what domestic producers have to report. How do you use revenues? This is where things start to get more political. Our sense, as we talk to stakeholders, is that you don't want to necessarily use revenues to blunt the cost of carbon that you want imports to pay as much as domestic producers, but it might make sense to use revenues to help defray the compliance costs, right, that producers in exporting countries might have to face when they produce their reports under your CBAM. And if you're going to be recycling or reusing revenues, and we can talk about how that might happen, it makes sense to cover those that are least able to meet those costs of compliance, and those tend to be small and medium enterprises. Your very large steel companies, many of you are in the room, you have departments, right, that run your emissions measurement and reporting systems. Many SMEs won't. Question number 4, what carbon prices do you credit for? And this again is one of the most politically difficult questions in the international space. Our advice, very simply, focus when you're crediting on explicit prices paid, right, by producers when you're importing products. The difficult political question comes up here, and I've heard this from many developing countries, is, well, that makes mathematical sense, but we've agreed under the Paris Agreement that each country will take its own path in addressing the climate crisis and in reducing its own emissions. What if my country's decision is to take measures to avoid deforestation? That's my contribution towards the climate crisis. Why shouldn't I somehow be able to have those measures and that contribution factored in? And the answer, and we went round and round on this for many days, the answer is simply, it's too hard. There's only so far that you can stretch equivalence before you start having to try and create an artificial system that tries to make every form of regulation equivalent. Treatment of exports. All I could dare to say here is that it's a decision about politics versus WTO law, right? And so the question here is, and this is a live one in the EU, we know, is do you enable exports to be exempted from pricing from covering the price of carbon when they export, right? On the basis that if their exports are going into a jurisdiction that doesn't require carbon pricing, if they include the carbon price in their exports are going to be at competitiveness risk. The problem is under WTO law, you cannot provide a subsidy that's contingent on a product being exported. And we had long, very philosophical debates. When you get to the set of guidance that we provided, there is no conclusion on this point because we essentially agreed to disagree. The arguments on both sides come down to whether you favour free trade and competitiveness or whether you favour climate action. And of course we favour both. So there's no guidance specifically there, but we lay out the arguments on each side. And the last key design feature is, do you provide special treatment for some producers or special treatment for some countries or companies? The guidance essentially is that a blanket exemption from a BCA for particular countries doesn't make a lot of sense. But coming back to the revenues point, it might make sense to provide targeted support for smaller and medium enterprises. Again, focusing on helping them to comply and perhaps defraying those costs rather than exempting them from the requirement to pay for the emissions embedded in their goods. So the technical story has been one that I think has helped, at least on the trade side, some of the discussion move forward. So maybe the very last point that we think is essentially where the discussion, at least in the trade policy community, is starting to go. And so we've started to do a bit of thinking on this. And here I'm leaning very heavily on my colleague Aaron Cosby's thinking. If a lot of the discussion in the trade policy space is going to be about the interoperability of border carbon adjustments, where might we start? And our suggestion is to focus on the three key elements of the compliance chain: measurement, reporting, verification. You all know these well. So if you're going to think about interoperability of border carbon adjustments, starting with the measurement step, could different governments looking at border carbon adjustments agree on the set of modules of measurement that a report might require, right? Can you define what feedstock production, what part is that? What the direct emissions from production, where that system starts and ends, and where electricity emission, where the system boundaries are for these different modules. If you could do that, the next step, and we admit this is the really, really difficult one, is to aim for carbon accounting standards that are similar enough that you don't have to have wholly different reporting by different companies within the same module of production. Turning to reporting, the ideal we think would be for governments to be able to coordinate reporting requirements across their border carbon regimes, right? At least so that firm information can be required in the same format and in the same way, so that your reporting of the goods you produce can follow a similar format, so that your reporting of your production processes can follow a similar format. And if timelines for reporting could be harmonized to an extent, our sense is that might help, but I'd be keen to hear what you think. And very lastly, and here's the interesting India example, mutual recognition between different border carbon adjustment systems of verifiers we think might be helpful. And so it was particularly interesting to see in the EU-India FTA, that is one of the elements that they've agreed, that there will be a discussion about recognizing verifiers of emission reporting in India, which will make it much easier for India to be able to produce these reports rather than having to rely only on EU-based, EU-certified accreditors of those emissions reports. So I've gone from the very high point to sort of taking you to the edge of where the thinking is at least in the trade policy community. And again, this is very much, I know, sort of the Geneva perspective on an issue that you all know much more intimately than we do. So I'd be keen to hear what you think of all of this advice and whether it speaks to you and what we're missing. That's it.
Fabulous, thank you. So I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle because I'm not a trade expert, but my work at BNEF involves writing research about the transition, which involves touching on competitiveness and trade as well as climate. I run our work on industry, decarbon transition, and technology and innovation. What I want to show today is a few slides just covering a bit about carbon, like I guess ETSs or compliance schemes, a bit about CBAMs. I'll really touch on the EU's because it has the most data around it and exists, and then touch a bit about what it means for the steel sector and show some data around that, which I think will hopefully help our discussion afterwards. So, Alice showed this slide already, but basically there's a lot of different carbon pricing mechanisms. As she pointed out very well, they are non-interoperable and actually weren't designed necessarily to be interoperable. And I think this idea of a border and carbon adjustment mechanism is interesting because it basically throws all of these systems into a place where they weren't designed to be. Just two examples on this chart. One, prices vary wildly. That x-axis is actually, I think it's in dollars, and it shows that obviously the EU's the most, or prices carbon in the highest market, highest price market, and you can see on the y-axis, this is the percentage of emissions covered by that jurisdiction. So no emissions are fully priced by any carbon kind of scheme. And really, most of them today are focused on the electricity sector as the sector to target. But what we are now seeing is a number of them moving towards a form of including industry, which is why we're here today and talking about this topic. Specifically, there's two different kinds that I'll touch on. I'm not going into details, but basically there's two ways you can kind of include industry. On the right-hand side here is what the EU does, which is basically say, we're going to include every sector, but we're going to give lots of sectors free allocations. Basically credit you back for emissions you would have paid, we'll give you a credit for it. And the way they're including industry now is by reducing those free allocations. So the EU plans to eliminate free allocations for industry by 2035. The UK will follow that. Other countries that issue free allocations, including China and Korea, have no plans to change that in the next few years, at least to 2030. And on the left-hand side, there's a baseline emissions intensity scheme. This is a little bit more complex to explain, but basically it means that either every sector or every facility has a certain amount of carbon they can emit for free, basically. And beyond that emissions threshold, they have to start paying. And the emissions thresholds, as you can see here, for certain markets are being reduced, i.e. becoming stricter from this year to 2030. Particularly, you can see here, Australia is a good example of that. There are so many debates we probably are not qualified to talk about on stage about why does this work this way and how does pricing work and how on earth do you integrate these kinds of models. But that's just a brief TLDR for those of you that are less clear about what these schemes look like. Now, the most famous, obviously, carbon pricing scheme in the world is the EU's, and this is our forecast for where that price is going. It looks quite scary to those of us who are paying or will be paying prices in Europe. Today, it's already at 80 euros a tonne. It doesn't always go up and to the right. It's a trade. It's trade-based, i.e. it's a market. And so it's not a price set by the government. It's not a price where they say this is how much carbon is worth. It's really based on supply and demand. And therefore, it can go up and down. But our forecast would be it goes up as we see the power sector really steeply decarbonize. As we see industry start to get thrown in there, we're going to see prices go higher and higher. Obviously, this is concerning for those emitters in Europe. Now, to date, industry in Europe, as I said, has had free allocations. More than that, some years they have more free allowances than they even necessarily need, and therefore they're making money from the EU ETS. And that was the case in 2023, as you can see here, particularly for the metals sector. However, both the combination of increased carbon pricing and reduction of free allocations means we are seeing, at least our forecast is, for a $15 billion bill for industry in 2030 due to the EU ETS. I'm not talking about CBAM right now. This is European industry will pay this price due to the EU ETS. But obviously that's due to the phasing out of free allocations, which is very much linked to CBAM. So let's talk a bit about steel and CBAM specifically. Obviously, CBAM covers many more industries than just steel. but really steel bears the brunt of both the volume and value of what CBAM promises. So you can see here it's 2/3 of the kind of value of imported goods into Europe or into the EU is steel and iron. And when you look at what that means for costs, here's just a simple example. The black dotted line here is the cost, or rather, I guess, the price of Northern European steel HRC spot. The red is what Chinese steel coming into Europe, what importers will have to pay in their CBAM obligation, assuming a default value. I know default values have been touched on briefly. It basically means if you haven't got your own carbon footprint for this particular ton of steel, there's a default value set for all of China. And this is it. Now, this gets quite steep, quite quick. Even by 2030, you're looking at maybe doubling the cost of that ton of steel to the importer, right? Because it's the importer that pays this price to the EU. Now, interestingly, it's not actually, or it shouldn't really be a big story for many Chinese producers. This chart here is a bit complex, but basically, we've got along the x-axis, the bottom there, is the default cost increase to your ton coming into Europe as a percentage. And on the y-axis, the vertical one there, that's the share of EU imports from that country. So China, on this chart, is about 0.5% of Chinese iron and steel goes to Europe. And that 0.5% will have, by this year, so 2026, it will be about a 28% cost, I guess, premium because of CBAM. Now, there's one outlier here you can see that's obviously very impacted, and that's India. India has, in the default values, has the highest default value for its emissions, and it has quite a significant exposure to the EU for its exporters. Other significantly exposed markets are South Korea and Ukraine and Turkey here, but they have a lower price to pay for CBAM. This is all very complicated because many of these, hopefully, these countries will find a way of getting verification done and will be able to actually prove proper emissions footprints, which will be lower, surely will be lower, I think, than default values. So these are not the prices that every single ton will pay. Okay, so I want to just wrap talking about, well, what is actually happening in the market today with regards to steel makers trying to circumvent paying these prices. Obviously, the way to avoid paying your obligation for CBAM and ETS is to reduce your emissions and then get verified for that ton of steel being lower carbon. There's many ways to do this. I'm not going to throw lots of acronyms at you, and many of you in the room will know these, obviously. But our analysis we do in-house, we build a lot of cost models around the cost of net zero steel. And it actually shows pretty much you can make net zero steel by 2030 that would be cheaper to make than paying your CBAM obligation in most markets. On the left-hand side here, you can see that it's going to cost you about $600 maybe dollars per ton to make crude steel. It's already cost competitive to actually turn scrap into steel through an EAF, and that is why we're seeing so many EAFs. Well, partially, we're seeing so many EAFs get announced in Europe and get announced in Asia. You're also seeing here costs for what would be a hydrogen-based route in blue and a CCS-based route in purple. We think the cheapest way, particularly in countries with plentiful gas, would be to make your DRI through gas and then run it through an EAF. And then do CCS, actually. So not actually build your EAF and do hydrogen, but continue with your blast furnace or other form of steel production and add on CCS. We're not actually seeing that get announced much in real life, but this is a cheaper way of doing things than pursuing hydrogen. As you'll know, the cost of hydrogen is hotly debated, and that very much depends on what premium you pay. On the right-hand side here, therefore, you can see the premiums you're looking at, anything from about 5% premium up to a 90% cost premium. That still may well be cheaper than the CBAM cost. And so we are therefore seeing a number of green steel projects get announced. We have a tracker we update every quarter, and we're now tracking many hundreds of green iron and green steel projects around the world. And if you look at the colors here, you can see lots of these are in Europe. And this is entirely driven by the ETS. There is some demand for low carbon steel in Europe from the consumer, but you wouldn't be making this high-cost steel if it wasn't for policy. We're also seeing the beginnings of an offtake market. A lot of this is voluntary. There is no mandates for green steel politically around the world. So in fact, all this is in theory voluntary, but a lot of it is driven by Europeans wanting to, I think, comply with some policy here. And you can see the number of offtakes signed by European countries. However, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. The chart I showed before only really covers about 5% of global steel production. So there is a push to go green, but it is not a very significant push. It is not, we think, taking into consideration the real threat that EU ETS and CBAM poses. And it seems like most players would rather pay the obligation, or wait and see what happens, actually, with CBAM and its vagaries, than commit billions of dollars to building green steel facilities. What companies are beginning to do, particularly in Asia and those exposed to the EU, are putting out statements of what they plan. Some will divert their steel to South America and Central America. Some will send only the high-value steel to Europe. Some are building specific projects that will be green steel just to send to Europe to comply with CBAM, while they still make, obviously, much higher emission steel for the rest of the markets. And you can see some quotes here from some companies who've talked about that publicly. So one final point is there's loads of ways to decarbonize steel. I think emissions trading schemes and CBAMs are one of those ways, but actually it's not sufficient. If CBAM to date, and it's been threatened for years and is now in force, is only really driving about 5% of global steel market to announce green projects, maybe what we will end up seeing is large amounts of revenue going to the EU because of CBAM, but maybe not that much decarbonisation. And so there do need to be other policies, and we may talk about it today. If not, I'm sure you already talked about it a lot today. We are also seeing a proliferation of policies to support the decarbonisation of projects that will come under the thumb of global carbon border adjustment mechanisms. We are seeing the EU particularly throw out various approvals of state aids at the member state level. We are seeing, obviously, as I think Alice touched on it, the recycling of revenues from the ETS to fund basically decarbonisation projects for steel and cement particularly. We are seeing in Japan and Europe a weird merging of EV policy and subsidies with green steel for EV subsidies. And we are also seeing, of course, some government procurement mandates for green steel. All of these may help companies avoid some of those CBAM charges. I think I'll end it there so we can have plenty of time for the discussion.
Some slides. You have a picture of us, I think. All right. Well, thank you very much for those insightful presentations and thought starters. I'm sure there are many things that you recognize, but hopefully some were new as well. Just to remind everyone that here in the room we have World Steel members, so steelmakers and national regional associations. But we also have representatives from what we tend to call the steel ecosystem. So with us we have some of our suppliers, we have some of our customers, we have think tanks, we have NGOs, we have academics, we have intergovernmental organizations, we have some consultancies, and I'm sure I missed some as well. So we really do have a very broad perspective. We did a little poll in the beginning, you missed that, but where we asked, how do people feel? Do they know what's going on in the steel transition? And how far do they think that we are? And actually the knowledge levels seem to be quite high. However, people were a little bit hesitating how far we are going. We're probably still in the early stages of the transition of the industry. So with that little background, I'm going to soon open up for questions from the floor, but I have a few that I prepared for our panelists or our speakers here. So please do think about questions that you want to ask, and we'll give you the chance shortly. So just to start us off, again, let's come back to border carbon adjustments as a concept, and what is the purpose? So we know that the EU CBAM is about carbon leakage, but at the same time it's also about encouraging other countries to, how can I say, introduce climate policies. But we also hear that there's a lot of criticism as this is seen as a protectionist measure. So what is your thoughts on this? Is it really about decarbonization or is it about protectionism? And how do we, I mean, you talked about some of the principles and how we can create these border carbon adjustments, but how can we make sure that we take sort of equality into account, that we ensure that there's actually leading to carbon mitigation? So that's a difficult question, a very open one, but I'll leave it to you to comment.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I think as you may have heard me not say, as I was explaining the advice that we've developed in the global stakeholder dialogue, essentially we were taking as given the fact that border carbon adjustments are about both the economics of the domestic sector and its decarbonisation, and about ensuring global climate ambition can move forward. Or at least this is what we take as given, the fact that there are governments are actually pursuing two different objectives here. And from a think tank's perspective, the objective we were seeking to help governments with was to say, well, if you are going to use border carbon adjustments, how can you make them supportive of your climate ambition as well as being fair to your own trading partners? And I think for all the political unhappiness with the idea of a border carbon adjustment measure, the idea of unilateral trade measures in general, my own personal sense is that they are a consequence of the structure of the Paris Agreement, if we go back to climate change. The idea of the Paris Agreement was that countries would move at different speeds, right? The whole idea was that those with historic responsibility for greater emissions and climate change would move faster and with more ambition in their climate policies, and those implicitly with less historical responsibility would move more slowly. And so we see the EU and other developed countries moving faster in their climate ambition and increasing carbon prices faster. But the reality of an integrated global economy is that it doesn't make sense for the EU to do that at the risk of deindustrializing itself completely. Then we wouldn't have a decarbonized steel sector, right, in the economies that we're trying to help move forward. So, so border carbon adjustments, while uncomfortable and politically unpleasant and technically difficult to tackle, are, I think, an inevitable consequence of the principles of the Paris Agreement being applied, and being applied in a world where, as you all well know better than me, global value chains are highly integrated and the global economy is highly competitive, particularly on commodities of the kinds your businesses produce. So maybe the last point is I sometimes find when I'm talking about border carbon adjustments outside expert rooms like this one, I describe it a little bit as, for those of us in the room who remember driving manual transmission cars, it's a bit like the clutch, right, that you needed to move from one speed to another in a car. It's a bit like the clutch that you need to help trade flow from a country with a slightly slower speed of climate ambition to one with a higher speed of climate ambition. They are unpleasant, they are difficult to deal with if you're an exporter, but they are, I think, inevitable because of the way we've structured international cooperation on climate change.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think that the EBTS, as an example, has been around since, well, what, the 1990s. Industry's been given a free pass on purpose, because the EU was so nervous about deindustrialization, and it's an expensive place to make steel, aluminium, cement, chemicals, fertilizer. As it is, it's already uncompetitive to make most of those things in Europe. That extra burden of a carbon price has already been paid, to be honest, by industry, because industry has been buying expensive, greener electricity that is at a premium because of the EBTS for decades. So industry hasn't had an entirely free pass. Also, industry in Europe that has on-site generation pays a carbon price. So actually, most emitters in Europe for industry will pay some sort of carbon price, implicit or not. This is just a way of basically saying, it's been 30 years, we should try and find a way of integrate industry. Also, the market is complicated, and we're running out of carbon if you're just pricing carbon for the power system. So if you're looking at it from an economics or a carbon trading economist point of view, we need new sources of carbon emitters to be integrated into carbon markets to keep them going, which is what the UK is facing right now. The UK has decarbonised its power sector so fast, and it's deindustrialised so fast, it's actually running out now of places to find carbon to keep its carbon market going. So I think it's so complicated. It goes well beyond competitiveness to this point of how do we keep these markets going when we've basically decarbonise the power sector and part of the transport sector. But I would suggest the last couple of years have thrown up tariffs and competitiveness and onshoring, at least, as a topic, because of a lot of the US's action, which definitely has made Europe act a lot more. If you look at things like the Accelerator Act and a lot of the energy competitiveness acts Europe has been kind of forced into through various wars, it does feel like a lot of politicians in Europe now are looking at CBAM a bit like a tool they can use for trade competitiveness, whereas that wasn't its design necessarily.
All right, let me sort of follow up on that thought, because as we know, steel is highly traded. Where I think it's close to 30% of steel produced that is traded intercontinentally. So that means not just crossing from Belgium to Germany, but from China to India or from US to somewhere else. And the industry is very much, so very trade exposed, and of course very much affected by tariffs. Trade, I should remind everyone here, is not a topic for the World Steel Association. I should probably quote our statement that we are for free and fair trade and the rules-based system. But still, I wanted to touch on how do we think, and I think you mentioned, well, one of you mentioned it in the presentation, how ETSs and BCAs might impact on the trade flows. Because I mean, at least I hear from members in various regions that the consequences of tariffs being put up somewhere means that trade flows take a different route. And that steel, for example, that cannot so easily go to the US anymore because of the high tariffs, go to other regions. And I sense the nervousness that steel, who won't be going to Europe anymore because of the CBAM costs, might be going somewhere else. So, do you agree with those statements, and how big a role do you think, or how big an impact do you think BCAs? Well, now we have CBAM as a concrete one, right? But in the future we might have other ones. How much do you think that would impact on the trade flows?
Well, yes, I think we're seeing already some companies publicly saying they're not going to send steel, at least low quality, low cost steel to Europe anymore. And as you said, there's definitely a risk that markets that already have had steel trade or steel flows into those markets exacerbated due to the US tariffs, so Central and South America, will also be places where a lot of Asia steel producers will maybe prefer to send their steel. Which is interesting. I mean, would that then mean that some of these South American countries implement their own BCAs? Because if lots of the Latin American countries are powered by hydroelectric dams, and they make incredibly low carbon materials. So that's actually interesting for them to think about, and that for them it would be less about decarbonizing, more about protectionism probably. The US is kind of the same. The US is thinking about a BCA because actually US steel is almost all made from scrap, and so they have an inherently low carbon footprint. So that might happen. There's another tangential debate that I have with my colleagues about what happens to Europe's steel sector. It's not a given that the EU ETS will force European steel to decarbonize. You probably can still make cheaper green steel. You definitely can make cheaper green steel in markets outside of the EU. So why would you rebuild an entirely new hydrogen furnace steel mill in Germany when you can build that same mill in Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Morocco much cheaper, and then ship it into Europe, and you're avoiding CBAM costs because it's net zero steel, and it's cheaper to make. So there's definitely a debate there that CBAM and ETS, removing industry free allocations, which are kind of, they're going hand in hand, may well actually create these interesting new markets that can make green steel cheapest, nearest the EU. So maybe not Australia, but definitely North Africa and the Middle East are really, and we're seeing this obviously in Sweden as well with Stegra. You're seeing markets pop up that would not naturally have been makers of iron and steel. You're also seeing a debate in Europe about why don't we just increase our scrap availability. Right now, a lot of markets in Europe, including the UK, are net exporters of scrap steel. Whereas really what they probably should be doing is keeping that domestically using EAFs. And that does change trade. That changes the trade for scrap steel as well.
I mean, maybe just at a very high level, I haven't seen the numbers. It's the sort of thing that we might want Simon Evanitt and the Global Trade Alert to do for us. But maybe coming back to the slide you showed, Claire, with the quadrants of different countries and their level of exposure versus their level of trade with the EU. I mean, essentially, trade will, I imagine, change direction if compliance with CBAM is extremely difficult, and or if exporters feel that they are not competitive once they've paid a CBAM cost into the EU. For exporters that feel they are still quite competitive because they have low carbon production and they've managed their compliance cost, their trade into the EU doesn't need to change. For countries like India, right, in the top right-hand quadrant, it's very difficult. And that may be, well, difficult unless you have an active engagement between the two governments about how CBAM's compliance costs can be managed, how verifiers can be assured, for example, which is what we see in the FTA. So, you know, if you're in the top right-hand quadrant, there's a real issue and your government needs to be talking to the others about what the implications are.
Before I open up for questions, I have one more topic that I thought I'll cover. Claire, in your presentation, you were showing that how different the carbon prices are in different systems or in different jurisdictions at this moment. How do we think that we can, well, how can we deal with that? And could the BCAs be a way to kind of level the playing field? And is it really fair that everyone is paying the same price of carbon? I mean, is it fair that a developing country is paying the same price in terms of euros as a developed country, for example? I mean, how should we? Because we talk a lot about the level playing field, right, in the steel industry, and it comes from the fact that we are so highly traded. But what is, in this context, what is a level playing field? And do we think that we can get to that with these mechanisms? Anyone who wants to go?
I can take that one first if you like, despite it being directed at Claire. You know, from an international trade development policy perspective, it would not be fair to expect your average developing country producer to pay the same cost of carbon, essentially because, you know, they're at an international political level, their country hasn't been responsible for the climate problem to the same degree as others. I think, you know, and there's a sort of the parenthesis in the middle there that I can sense from the room is, yes, but they are our direct competitors. Why shouldn't they pay exactly the same cost as we do, right? That's the level, that's the playing field that needs to be leveled. I get that. I also think that the political reality as governments see the question of carbon pricing is that they are going to move at very different speeds, right? It has taken, as Claire was saying, it's taken the EU a very long time to get to the stage where it's starting to ramp up its carbon price. Every country's policy decision about how to price carbon, tax, emissions trading, intensity-based, something else, which sectors to cover, how fast to increase prices, what scopes to include, every one of those decisions is an extremely difficult political question domestically, right? Just ask any government that's tried to talk to farmers about pricing emissions. It's not an easy conversation. And inevitably, every government is going to have to take a slightly different approach or a very different approach to how they price carbon, both how they design it and the price they start and eventually ask their economies to pay.
It's an interesting philosophical debate to have. But the issue is no one dictates what, I mean, if we could decide what is the value of a ton of CO2, and if there was a global agreement on what it actually should cost, then you could have a level playing field. The challenge is the carbon price changes. In fact, you don't even know what the carbon price is in most markets because it's truly just decided by what a hedge fund decides they want to pay that morning. It's incredibly opaque. Even knowing where carbon prices are going involves massive models that everyone's building. So I think it's really hard to say we'll ever get markets that will all align. I think you mentioned in I think one of your last slides what a good BCA looks like, and you mentioned this idea of there should be some compensation, and that the EU has now agreed that although they believe, and I think it's true, it is the most robust carbon market in the world, they are willing to accept other they're giving discounts basically to imported goods that have paid a carbon price abroad. I think that's a really big concession, because that was something I think a lot of maybe purists within the EC weren't necessarily that willing to do in the past. But it's being done at a value, or the price paid, which is your point. It's the easiest way of doing it, because you can prove if I've paid a carbon price in China, I have a certificate of that, I can prove that and send that off with my export. The challenge obviously is no carbon market in the world is at the high levels that the EU is. I think at the moment the carbon price in China is about $4 or $5. So you're seeing really any credit you're paying in another country is such a small amount, it's almost negligible. But over time, as those markets develop, I guess the EU's hoping with this idea of there being a credit, it might actually stimulate other markets to become maybe stricter, more robust, or give out less free allocations. And in that way, maybe we will see a bit more of a level playing field of sorts if other prices in other markets rise. But your point about exchange rates is, well, I think you were hinting at the exchange rate is also a challenge. The value of the EU and its strength, the euro will absolutely make a difference as to what other markets pay, which is also really unfair. But I'm not sure how you get around that.
All right, so let me open up for questions. Okay, I see a few hands. Let's start with Edwin. You had your hand up first. And when you ask a question, please do introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. I'll call you Claire now. Thanks, Åsa. I'm Edwin. I'm with worldsteel. Two questions, if I may. One to Alice and one to Claire. Alice, in your slides at the beginning, you had a kind of a political story, and then a second slide talking about what you call technical stories. And one of the points, maybe I misunderstood you there, was one of the considerations under the technical story is that we should really think about carbon relocation only towards those products that could actually relocate, if I understood you correctly. Now, does that not mean the focus on the current system, focusing only on this sort of hard-to-abate sector, is actually the wrong way around? You know, because there's, in theory and in practice, small chance that a steel company will physically relocate from here to there. And therefore, are we not focusing at the wrong end of the market? And that then takes me to some of the comments that Claire made earlier, and I quite agree with all of your questions on why should we be making steel in Europe. But okay, it is what it is. My question is actually a different question. In terms of the current setup, whether it's ETS and BCA or the combination between the two, we're focusing on, again, high commodity range products. But as also said, we not only see quite a lot of trade in these products, we see at a higher level quite a robust trade in all markets, but specifically in Europe, on steel-containing goods coming in and out of Europe. And these are currently outside the scope of the evaluation. So two questions really. One is, should we include them in the scope, as many in Europe wants to do? If we do not include them in the scope, do we potentially run the risk in the long run that we could lose this baseload market at the bottom end, steel flows back and forth, and only having this sort of steel-containing goods market as the only remaining market in the European context? So both of you are welcome to answer both questions, but probably we should start with Alice then.
Sure, happy to take that one. And here's where we need to try and unpack the concept of leakage a bit more than I did in my presentation. So at least my understanding is the idea behind a border carbon adjustment is that you should focus on the products, or rather the emissions, to be more precise, the emissions at most risk of leakage. And the Commission tends to talk about emissions leakage, right? And by which I understand they mean sort of the very blunt idea that a steel company might close its factory in Europe and move it to somewhere just outside of Europe, right? So the actual production moves. But I think more broadly what they have in mind is the idea that European production would be displaced by imports, right, from outside of Europe. In either of those scenarios, the emissions at a conceptual level leak, right? So either your physical production physically moves, or your relative production moves because you're consuming in Europe more imports, emissions of which come from outside Europe, than you are of products in Europe. So perhaps I oversimplified, but I think the idea here is to focus on emissions leakage rather than just factories moving. I'll come in after Claire's answered the next question.
Yeah. So there is a hot debate about, yes, do we expand CBAM to downstream products? Obviously, if you're a maker of steel in Europe, or you're a maker of dishwashers in Europe, you are very concerned about the increased cost due to the ETS of making your final product. And as you said, is it fair that a dishwasher maker in Europe has to, buying European steel, for instance, if they wanted to, which has that ETS price embodied, is that fair that they have to compete with imports to Europe of dishwashers that don't have any carbon price kind of implied in their cost? It's obviously something that a number of players have lobbied hard for. The EU initially, I think, just thought it'd be far too complicated. There's so many questions about how you do the carbon accounting for anything that isn't the already large number of steel products they've already listed. The EU's done, it's not just one, steel isn't one thing. They've already had to account for dozens and dozens of products. Adding in radiators, dishwashers, hairdryers, it becomes kind of insane. The challenge obviously is, to your very good point, do you end up with a market that no longer makes any primary iron and steel and is just importing finished goods? And the debate is live. The EU or the EC is going to debate it, I think, in Parliament in September. So interestingly, obviously the CBAM came into force on Jan 1, and we are still having debates about what it even means and what its boundaries are. But there's definitely a real chance it does get extended downstream. The challenge is then you have downstream aluminium and steel maybe in scope, but do you then do downstream for fertilizers? No, because that then hits the food and the farmers debate, which is very thorny. Do you do a downstream for cement? And chemicals right now, petchems aren't even included in CBAM because the idea of doing downstream chemicals carbon accounting is even more insane and basically impossible. So it does create this debate. How are you treating different sectors differently? And really, are you giving in to lobby groups to a certain extent? And obviously the European Union is very nervous of that.
I mean, maybe just the only other little comment is that this is a debate we're following sort of at the Geneva end quite closely, because while CBAM's application was quite limited to relatively basic products produced by high capital industries like yours, the impact on the rest of the world was quite easy to trace and identify, and the countries with a stake in the discussion was, wide enough, but also relatively limited. If you begin to apply CBAM to imports of all of these other finished products, your range of businesses and your range of countries affected by the measure and your number of political problems with those countries as you have to re-explain exactly what all of these new sectors have to do, the multiplication effect, I think, is a real concern from those of us looking at the broader implications of measures like these on the developing world.
Thank you. Yeah, so Gabriel, please go ahead. You have a microphone in the middle of the table. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Gabriel Rosenberg. I am the founder of CBAMBoo. We offer software and advisory services exclusively on CBAM. I've been going for a couple of years now. Very much enjoyed the discussion. One of the outstanding items on the EU's checklist right now is how they're going to account for the carbon price paid. It's something that, Claire, you just mentioned as a sort of a concession to non-EU producers that they can offset carbon price paid. And the legislation for that has not been fully finalised. It's in draft form. And reading it, I wondered whether it could actually work, ever. And I would be interested to know your thoughts. The problem is that, as you expertly explained, every carbon price is two carbon prices, a cost and a subsidy of some sort. And the EU has basically said that companies will need to demonstrate not just that they have paid the price, but also that they haven't received a subsidy, or at least that they've offset all the subsidies that they have received. And in order to do that, you presumably need someone to audit their financials, right? So I just wonder whether that's ever going to actually happen, or whether it is a kind of ornament on the legislation that is not intended to be used at all.
Yeah, well, you are more of an expert than I am on CBAM, but I share your skepticism. It goes into this whole debate about how do you even get verified. At the moment, it's very unclear who is officially allowed to verify your emissions. My understanding is it really is just bodies in Europe that will begin to be the verifying bodies, but that's obviously other countries are claiming that's incredibly unfair. You mentioned the free trade agreement between India and the EU beginning to scope out what it would look like to have domestic certifiers. But yeah, at the moment, everyone's basically just going to have to pay the default, which we know is some sort of magical calculation that's unclear with basically a penalty put on top. So that it's very unlikely most producers are actually emitting that much carbon. Now, obviously, the EU says it's to force people to do verification, and it's in their best interest, therefore. But if you can't really do the verification, or to your point, even if you can't really actually get a rebate for the carbon you paid because you really can't prove you didn't get some sort of backhanded deal or under-the-table deal, then it basically becomes all of a moot point, and you're basically being penalised for emissions that aren't even yours, which obviously is, I would say, unfair. You're right; it's complicated. I'm very intrigued to see what happens and how it evolves. But yeah, I don't know any more than you do, and share your skepticism.
All right. Yeah, I see a hand over there. Yeah, please go.
Hello.
Just go.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Sangeet Selvaraju from the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE. My question's for Alice. You answered one of the questions around, the legitimacy of the CBAM and why developing countries should taking it back to Paris, and kind of basis of kind of most of climate stuff today. The other bit of that has been finance, which is what most developing countries is kind of the other part of this. Some form of flows for compensation, etc. So I guess my question is linked to this, because you touched on this in one of your revenues piece. Mm-hmm. Some developing countries have said, well, we just want to keep the revenues here, charge an export tariff at the exit point, and keep that money for industrial decarbonization, because clearly someone's got to pick up the tab for this, because it's not happening commercially yet. I'm curious about your kind of thoughts about whether that's how do you kind of look into some of the governance structures around that? The first of that is the EU-India piece. There's a 500 million euro announcement to do some of that. So interested to hear your thoughts on kind of what are the things that you can move the needle on things of that nature.
Shall I go ahead? Okay. This is really, really, really interesting. And I think maybe in the context of the stakeholder dialogues, we had two different discussions about sort of financing and financial flows. And one was about the use of revenues, right? The idea of revenue recycling. And this has been an active discussion in the EU context. Many other think tanks have been pushing for this, not just in the EU context, but also in the context of the UK's design of their own border carbon adjustment. And sort of the argumentation evolved, I think, right? So the first simplest argument was some revenues from border carbon adjustment mechanisms should go back almost entirely to at least the countries, if not the exporters themselves, to defray these costs. That's the most extreme version. Many of the response often from government's thinking of how to manage revenues was, well, we can't, Treasury will always tell us we cannot hypothecate revenues from a particular source. Some countries sort of managed to get around that. But then the discussion, at least in the global stakeholder dialogue, was about, well, shouldn't there be some other sort of financing mechanism additional to current climate financing that's either run by a country by itself, and it's not necessarily a directly hypothecated CBAM revenue, but it's some additional allocation of budgetary revenue, either to defray compliance costs or to help with decarbonisation more generally. We had a long debate about whether doing that on a country-by-country basis was better than contributing to a big multilateral fund, who should be the best sources of receipt of finance. So we had a long debate about how revenue might be recycled and practically how that could work. The other interesting debate we had was about whether exporters who were in a country that applied an export tax should be able to credit that export tax, right, when their exports arrived in a CBAM jurisdiction. And they're the two arguments. And again, if you get to the guidance, there's no conclusion on that one either, because on one side, you do want a country to be able to start taxing for some recognition of carbon emissions, and to be able to begin applying some of those costs even to a section of a sector, right? Even if it's just to exports, beginning to introduce the concept of a carbon tax, even just to exports, might be a way of gradually building support for the idea that could be applied across the sector. So the climate folks in the group said, start with something small, right? That's fine. The trade folks said, well, that's not really applying a proper carbon pricing scheme, right? It's not really, it's never going to be enough to really force the decarbonisation that we want to see and the levelling of the playing field that we want to see happen. So again, there are arguments on both sides, and in the end we couldn't decide which was the stronger argument, because it depends on how you want your border carbon adjustment to work and what its priority policy objective is, I think. I'll leave it at that for now. But
yeah, no, that's great. Do we have any more questions in the room? Please don't be shy. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment as well. Yeah, Ed, please.
Yes, I've got 20 years of ETS calculation experience, and even I found it hard to do CBAM, EU CBAM. So how they expect somebody else in a country that's not got an ETS to do it is beyond me. So for ETS, for example, you've got two, in the UK, it's based on the EU system. So you've got two reports you have to do, one for sources, one for benchmarks. And the benchmark one gets you free allocation, works out your free allocation. But you don't calculate precursors in that. So when I have a verification of ETS, it doesn't look at precursors. So now when we're speaking to our verifiers about how they're going to do CBAM, because we don't want to verify ETS and then verify CBAM. We want to do it in one. But also for CBAM, it's more related to the route of the steel, because if you've got 3 steel plants and it goes through 3 steel plants, it'll pick up carbon on the way. So it's even more complex. So I think that the problem with CBAM being derived, like EU CBAM, using data from ETS is that it's not comparable data in some cases. And the actual data, I mean, it takes me probably 10 days a year, 250 spreadsheets to work out ETS. And then on top of that, I've got CBAM, which is another 10 spreadsheets. CBAM Boo might be able to do it for me a lot quicker. But for steel, it's a very complex calculation, particularly with scrap, because you go down to each individual type of scrap has a different embedded CO2 in it. So I just find it too complex. And I would like to suggest that worldwide a price of carbon per tonne would be a lot better, but we're not there. So I can see where people are coming from other countries who say, how am I going to calculate this and verify it? And that's when it's punitive, because the calculation is too complex to be able to verify it, and therefore you're paying a punitive carbon cost.
Yeah,
It's not fair.
completely agree. I mean, probably you will know this, but the EU ETS decides what emissions look like based on a technology pathway for steel, and CBAM looks at it from a product point of view. So they're not even the same thing. So yeah, as you said, it's incredibly complicated. And obviously other carbon markets calculate it in different ways. So yeah, fully agree. And I do wonder if it will end up just being the default values end up being almost cheaper because you're not then paying huge amounts in consulting fees and you're not hiring people to do it as a full-time job in the company, unfortunately. And then that doesn't really drive decarbonisation. Because if you're penalised by paying the national default emissions, irrespective of whether you are a green steel plant, then then it really ends up being basically about protectionism as a policy. It's no longer really about driving global decarbonisation. So yeah, it's challenging.
We mentioned a little bit, I don't remember who of you had it in the presentation, but around, I think it was you, Alice, around harmonization. So since you're not from our normal, how can I say? No, let me start over. At World Steel, we found that greenhouse gas accounting is extremely important. And our members, it's something that we cannot agree on how to define low carbon steel, but we can all agree that we need to account for the emissions in the same way. And it's something that we worked on literally for decades. I do also believe that the members of World Steel who are reporting to our different systems are quite knowledgeable in carbon accounting, in particular when it comes to life cycle assessment and then to our site-based greenhouse gas emission reporting system. But there are so many standards out there for GHG accounting in general. We're having a special session on that tomorrow because steel is everywhere. It's traded, as we know. It's used in all kinds of applications. There are standards and requirements for reporting. I'm sure our members who are sitting here are doing, reporting in 10 different systems, each of them. And these systems are adding to it, of course. And we know that we're going to get more of them. So harmonization or some kind of aligning. I saw that you had this idea of kind of blocks that you're reporting and then you harmonize on those and so on. So what is the appetite from governments, as you see it now, to actually take this into account? Because what we see otherwise in the harmonization, everyone talks about harmonizing, but they want to harmonize it according to their methodology, right? So there is not much interest for me to harmonize according to yours, rather, everyone is demanding the other way. So is there, I know that there is some work, there was a new, I can't remember what it's called, an international forum, I think on carbon pricing, that was launched at COP last year between governments to try to discuss these topics and so on. So at least you see the words from time to time. But what's your feeling from a government sort of perspective? Are they interested in harmonizing? Would you say? Or I understand that you don't have answers, but kind of what's your feeling?
Well, on behalf of all the governments in the world, I will say, most governments want you to succeed. They, if I'm the government, I'm from New Zealand. If I'm the government of New Zealand, I want whatever harmonization or international system will help New Zealand have one small steel producer. I want my New Zealand steel producer to benefit from whatever system we're establishing, right? They want what is best for you, individually. I think your challenge, if I may, is to give them, and there are many forums now, I listed some of them, there are many forums where they are trying to talk to each other about what might be best collectively. And I think your challenge as an industry is to start sending some clear messages in about what collectively you would like to see your governments do collectively that helps all of your businesses, but maintains all of your various competitive preferences, and you will strongly compete with each other, that's a given. Your governments will want you to keep competing with each other will want you to win, right? Their own government, their own companies to win. But if you can help them identify what they could do collectively to make all of your lives better, I think they would be very interested in hearing what that is from you guys and from the aluminium people too, because as Claire's slides have told us, when we're talking about emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors, it's you guys and aluminium, and to a lesser extent, chemicals and others. So I think that's your challenge. Help them to see whether it's sort of, what is the pre-competitive space where you do want harmonization to happen, and tell them what you want it to look like.
All right. Any more questions, thoughts, comments in the room? Yeah, Jose, please.
I do have a reaction to your comment and your answers in this regard. Maybe it's time for asking IPCC, that it's the technical body that asks for the governments for the inventories based in scope 1 and 2, or only scope 1 for energy usage or generation, and including, for once in a time, the consumption aspect. You mentioned the embodied emissions in the goods that are imported to every country. This is not considered today in the maximum technical references that at the end of the day ends up in an NDC, a national determined contribution, that it's the strategy of every country. I guess this is the right spot to ask the expected harmonization of the accounting rules to start with. Your reactions or comments on this? Thanks.
I mean, to preface with, I'm not an IPCC expert. Maybe to clarify my point, I think at the trade and economic level, what governments want to do is to make your lives easier and to cooperate collectively in terms of your own industry's reporting. I think that is a more achievable, bounded problem and objective than trying to change the way governments report at a very global level across all of their economies. But that's just a knee-jerk reaction. I'm not an IPCC reporting expert.
And neither am I, so I'm sorry, Jose, I can't tell you if that's the right place. All right, let's see. First one hand over there, and then over there. So.
Can you?
Yeah. Go.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Going back to your question also about.
Yes. Now it's good.
Okay. Awesome. Going back to your question also about our government asking for this harmonization, and I should introduce myself. My name is Ankita Gangotra. I'm at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and I coordinate IDDI, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which is a coalition of governments working with a lot of the stakeholders across this room to create lead markets for steel, cement, and concrete through green public procurement and through the promotion of harmonization of standards. So I certainly can't answer for all countries in the world, but I can maybe venture a guess through the countries that work with us that yes, they are asking for harmonization, at least when it comes to standards that cater to green public procurement policies or cater to embodied carbon policies. And now we're also seeing the Open Coalition, for example, that was launched at COP30. And then now, I think 3 weeks ago, I think it's the EU, Brazil, and China working together on aligning, or what it means to align these MRV systems, etc., across emissions trading schemes. But it remains to be seen what that leads to. But another comment is this need for sort of alignment and harmonization across policies. You know, when we talk about green public procurement policies and the standards being used for that and their product level standards, right? Are they talking to the production level standards? And are they talking to the sort of emissions trading scheme standards and the CBAM standards? And there was a comment made on how ETS standards are production-based, whereas CBAM will be product-based. And so there are those complexities to also think about and align and harmonize across policies? Thanks.
And actually across sectors as well, because, I mean, again, in IDDI, we are discussing about harmonization or aligning between steel and cement and concrete as well, because we are also competitors, right? So we need to make sure that each sector is treated sort of equally, at least, that the competition is fair. Let me take one more question, and then Samuel.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, congratulations on such a great, insightful discussion, and also on, I think, the first and maybe the only female-only panel of the conference. So I think that's very welcome. On the question of carbon price, I think it's important to reflect that it's a very necessary part of the equation. I think if it wasn't for the carbon price, we probably wouldn't see the pipeline of projects that we do have currently, both in Europe and outside Europe. And of course, the CBAM is the necessary counterpart to this carbon cost in Europe. So from steelmaker perspective, I guess the main fear, and that's reflected in the discussions now on improving the CBAM, is to what extent that's just pushing the carbon leakage risk downstream, right? And of course, if in the end the downstream industry is the one suffering and leaking outside of Europe, then we don't need the steel production in Europe anymore, because the customers are producing elsewhere. So one question I have is, to what extent could it be useful to use material level emission factor? That would address all the complexity related, of course, to the monitoring, the verification, the extension of the scope, which becomes very complex if you go to more complex goods, which might have, in the case of a car, 100 different like steel components of different grades with different embedded emissions, right? But you know how much steel is in the car. Like you can have that data quite easily. And that would probably also work for the export part, because you know how much steel is in the product, and you could apply the same like material level sort of emission factor. Not a punitive one like the default values we have today, but some sort of average value. Just an idea, and then a question, more from a legal perspective, to what extent that could maybe make the CBAM more or less WTO compatible if it was based on such a more emission intensity factor.
I actually don't know that I have anything valuable to add. I think it's an interesting idea. I'm sure it was discussed back in the day when they were trying to work out what they were doing. I actually don't know why they decided to CBAM was going to be this, product level. But it's ISO products, right? So I guess they align around ISO because that is an international standard. It's understood. And that makes sense, because what they wanted to do was, I guess, not go down the route the ETS does of thinking about technology pathways or production pathways. I think they thought that what they're doing now is actually much easier internationally for people to comply with. It's not, but it's not too different from what you're suggesting, I think, really. You're suggesting maybe even more simplified than what they've gone with. But I don't know enough about the internal debates they had to decide why this path and not what you're suggesting. I don't know. Actually, I don't know about WTO at all. I don't know what you think. Do you speak to people at the WTO who think there would have been better ways to do this than the way they've done it?
Well, let me answer the question perhaps sort of tangentially, because I think, the classic lawyer's answer is it depends on how you did it and what other countries were doing. Maybe one sort of first principles point to make, which I alluded to briefly in the presentation, is that one thing that's interesting is that the European Commission has studiously avoided raising CBAM in the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, and avoided notifying it formally as a technical barrier to trade, because the Commission argues it is not a trade measure, it is an environment measure. And so that means we haven't had a discussion in the World Trade Organization context about whether the TBT agreement, with all of its principles and obligations to use international standards, should apply to CBAM or not, because the Commission's been very careful in not notifying it in that context to stay aligned with their argument that it's an environment measure. And that's why it's been actually very interesting in the Committee on Trade and Environment to see countries like Japan, and credit to the government of Japan, to start to bring forward ideas about how measures like CBAM should be notified outside of the formal technical space, in an environment space. What information should members be required to share with other members? And so CBAM, sort of by the way that the EU has managed the process very consciously and carefully, as far as I can tell, exists in a sort of slightly grey area in the WTO context. It's been discussed purely as an environment measure by design, and so it's not clear yet in a formal context which of the WTO agreements would apply and how, by how the politics has been managed.
All right. Well, we're at the end of the day. We're at the end of the session. So I'm going to leave this here now. I get this feeling that there is a lot of thinking going around in the in the room. I see some nodding faces. Thankfully, the day doesn't end here. We are going to go for dinner. I think most of us will join us there. And there will be plenty of opportunities to sort of dive into the details of this. So before I give you some practical information, let me please join me in thanking my excellent speakers. You can go